Hello and welcome to this video on crystal structures. These are the fundamental arrangement of the atoms, compounds, and chemicals that make up solid matter. Different solids have different inclusions and degrees of order to their crystalline lattice. The nature of a crystal can be broken down into units called cells. These are small, three-dimensional representations of the whole crystal. As you are measuring the structure in 3 dimensions, you can also measure the arrangements that fit into this space. This lets you know how many arrangements are possible. It's generally accepted that there are up to 230 possible configurations based on this. You can think of this as how many ways you can fit a series of repetitive shapes into a given space. Each unit or cell is defined one of 3 ways: a simple cube, body-centered cube, or face-centered cube. This lets you measure 6 points of reference. Each of these is a configuration of the XYZ system. Different types, but certainly not an infinite number, of these cell configurations are possible, and they're then further defined based on their level of symmetry. While there's a lot more to this part of the topic, we'll move on to the next part for now. If you'd like to know more, please see the links below. The most common way to see something like a metal in a crystal form is to have a series of spheres packed into each other. This is just small ball-bearing type shapes, jammed together as tightly as they can. It's possible for something like a metal to be configured somewhat differently to the simple cube type structure, but the rules of the cube, as far as representation go, apply here. The first is simply that of a triangle in a single plane. Each plane has the atom at its center and 6 atoms immediately around it. When you depict your crystal this way, it has certain advantages. The first and simplest is that once you start stacking layers on top of each other, you can place each of the molecules in the hole between the other molecules on the layer below it. This gives you a nice, solid representation that stacks cleanly and neatly. Another kind of way to look at this, other than the 3 ways of drawing a cube that we've mentioned, are to look at them based on the angles between the different parts of the crystals. For example, within each unit or cell, there are 6 sides. Between the nodes or corners of each side, what is the angle, as it's no longer a cube? This can produce a variety of shapes. Cubes, parallelograms, rhombuses, and similar being more common than other shapes. This is important when we're looking at units that aren't going to be cubic, that is, those cells that aren't a pure square, and that can be important for very large units, something we'll get onto shortly. The nice, neat, regular cubic shapes are often seen in synthetically grown crystals, where the consistent pressure and heat ensure that they assume a common standardized format. This format is uninterrupted by inclusions or other foreign matter. When we're talking about the possible structures, we should start looking at some of the chemicals most commonly seen assuming a crystalline pattern. Carbon is diamond, silicon is glass, and there are a few others. These work very well in forming crystals because they have covalent bonds. This leads to different ways they can form their crystal structure. Looking at carbon in particular, it can have up to 4 very quick, easy associations because there are 4 openings in its electron shell that can then attach to other carbons or other elements as well. Once you start looking at these on a big scale, you get to something called a buckyball. The buckyball is 60 carbons all associated together. They assume a spherical shape once bonded together. Each carbon has 3 other carbons that it's associated with, and in turn, each of these is associated with 3 more. This small cell is called graphite, and it's achieved by up to 12 carbon rings all attached to each other. These 12 rings form the sphere. Each ring has 5 sides, and there are 20 rings in total. This means that your total structure is the 60 carbons. Like many other crystals we could mention, buckyballs are incredibly strong and are almost entirely incompressible. Different crystal lattices will have different units that make it up, but on average you can look at something like the buckyball as a good example of how a crystal is made and how different parts of it add up and build together to create the whole. The buckyball is also a great example of something else. Packing spheres. This is a general catch-all term for how you model the three-dimensional sphere of a solid all compressed into a single small space, and how much of it you can fit if everything is identical. This is useful if we're looking at, say, metals, but it can also find application in other roles. Things like how much medication can you fit into a single small package that can be delivered in a particular way. This sort of information is important if you're looking at how to package drugs most efficiently. For example, if you take a simple cube format and try to stack as many molecules or atoms in a particular area as you can, you'll find that only a little over half of the total space is actually utilized by the atoms. This means that it's not a very efficient approach to packing in the contents. In a similar way, spheres can also have issues in how much wasted space you have. Wasted space is not the only issue when we're looking at lattices though. As a general rule, no crystal is ever perfect. You can have a vast array of imperfections. These affect the total order of what you're seeing. A small inconsistency, small defect, or imperfection can include things like the addition of an unintended compound, something like carbon in steel. You can also have atoms occupying an extra space, having extra atoms, or missing an atom entirely. If this occurs in that lattice, you can have the lattice not working properly in that location, not having the right connections in the right way. The atoms, if they are found to be included as extras or occupying somewhere they shouldn't be, are called interstitials. This can also be called an impurity, when it's an atom that is different from the host crystal atoms, that is the standardized pattern for all the other cells. This gives you vacancies and interstitials. This is where you're either missing or have an extra atom where it shouldn't be, and impurities, where you have an atom present that is deviating from the pattern that the rest of the cells follow. To summarize this, there are four main categories of crystals, and they're put together based on chemical and physical properties. The first, if you're familiar with chemistry, is based on the bond. These are called covalent crystals. They have a true covalent bond between all of the atoms that are involved. It effectively creates one giant molecule. These sorts of crystals are incredibly difficult to deal with because they are extremely resistant to being interfered with. Diamond is a great example. Metallic crystals are next, and they're made up, as would be indicated by their name, from metal-type ions. The crystals are built in a lattice, and the outer electrons of these are free to float around and interact. Because of this and the rest of the nature of the crystal, they're very dense, but also have a melting point that is achievable despite being incredibly high. Steel is an example of this. Next are your ionic crystals. These require ionic bonds, and that is electrostatic forces keeping them together. These also have a relatively high melting point and are incredibly hard, but will also break readily under the right circumstances. Table salt or sodium chloride is an example of this sort of crystal, where it will readily dissociate in water under the right circumstances. Finally, you have molecular crystals, and these have a slight difference to the others. They rely more on van der Waals forces or hydrogen bonding to create a relative solid. Because of this, they tend to be much softer and have a low melting point. This means that water is perhaps the most common and easiest example to understand. The hydrogen within the H2O molecule is what allows it to form a crystal and solidify at a relatively low temperature. This sort of knowledge is important in pharmacology, chemistry, biochem, and a few other areas. It's used to define how many antibodies can bind to antigens on a given surface, how many drugs to fit in a given pill or tablet. To understand different features of the crystals that are being used in devices, metallurgy, and more. It may not seem like anything particularly important. Most people would imagine a crystal is simply a relative solid that's been compounded and constricted at a high temperature until it's solidified to that point. But there's more to it, and there's certainly far more to crystals than just diamonds and similar precious stones. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.